As many of you know, my early years was on a peach orchard in Fort Valley, Georgia, one of the largest in the state. It was family owned, and I grew up in my grandparents' home. That home and the peach orchard are still active today. The peach orchard is still one of the largest in the state, and the home is now a museum. It has passed hands, but it is still active. Many of my grandmother's items are still in the house today. So I understand exactly how the family felt for where we're going today. It was a rice plantation from 1806, and it was still a plantation, although it didn't do rice, in 1973. And it was all in the same family. In 1973, with the death of the last remaining heir, she donated it to the state of Georgia. Welcome to the Hofwyl rice plantation. Thank you for coming to Keeping History on Two Wheels. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button. It's right over here on the left. Don't forget to hit that bell so that you'll be notified whenever we do an upload, and we do one each and every week. Last week we talked about how the rice plantations were built and the life of the slaves. How they had to contend with snakes and mostly the alligators and the hard life that they had. We talked about who these slaves were 2 weeks ago and where they came from and why their expertise in rice cultivation in Africa was the reason the plantation owners kept them in the low country. This week we will finish up with this 3-part series with the life of the plantation owner, particularly the plantation of Hofwyl Broadfield Plantation in Darien, Georgia, from beginning to end, and how and why this particular story may and should sound very familiar to you. Somewhere around 1806, William Brailsford bought the property on the Altamaha River consisting of woodland and cypress swamps. He and his slaves began clearing the land and constructing the rice paddies in the 4-step process outlined last week. As we talked about, he would work during the day on the plantation but would retreat to his home further inland at night, as it was thought at the time that the malaria sickness that many suffered was due to swamp gases, so most plantation owners wouldn't stay overnight. But it was felt that the slaves were better suited for it, even though most fell sick within a week of arrival. The culprit of the sickness would be discovered many years later. William and his wife Maria had a daughter, Camilla. Maria and Camilla took over the plantation when William died in 1810. Now Camilla went on to marry Dr. James Troup, the brother of then Georgia Governor Troup. James took over the plantation and even added to it. In 1849, Broadfield Plantation totaled around 7,300 acres, and the plantation had 357 slaves. James and Camilla had a daughter, Ophelia, who inherited a large portion of the plantation. She married George Dent. George and Ophelia owned the plantation during the Civil War. George and their 15-year-old son James joined the Confederate Army, while Ophelia went to a refugee camp in Waycross. If you're familiar with the story of Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, this is where the similarities begin, and there's a good reason. The slaves having been freed, it seemed all but the property had been lost, and after the war, even large tracts of it had to be sold off to pay the taxes. George and Ophelia kept growing rice with the few laborers left to help. In the 1880s, their son James assumed control of the plantation. By this time, the plantation's wealth was depleted, and the family was poor with the exception of will, spirit, and fortitude. James continued to grow rice until 1913, when he passed away, leaving the plantation to his 3 children, Gratz, Miriam, and Ophelia. Gratz and Miriam established a dairy on the plantation. Gratz, with the help of Miriam, built the dairy buildings, and upon his death, Miriam and Ophelia took over total operations, with Miriam taking the lead. They had the help in the form of a descendant of the plantation's former slaves, Mr. Rudolph Capers. Remember this gentleman. He will come up again later. Miriam and Ophelia ran every aspect of the plantation. However, Ophelia was the social butterfly, so to speak. She had friends in very high places. Friends such as the DuPonts of financial fame, and an author who would become the 20th century's prolific author of Gone with the Wind, Miss Margaret Mitchell, who was Ophelia's best friend. And when you visit the plantation today, look on a small table in the parlor. You'll see a small framed picture of Miss Mitchell. And it's highly likely that the major portion of the storyline and characterizations of the plantation's Tara and Hofwyl Broadfield are one and the same. I loved seeing this bell up on the building. My grandparents used to have one just like it. That's how my grandmother would call us all to dinner. Miriam Dent would pass away still unmarried in 1953, leaving the plantation solvent and in the most capable hands of Ophelia, who would live there until her death in 1973, also still unmarried. In her later years, Ophelia wanted the plantation to survive and her family's legacy to live on, so she donated the plantation to the state of Georgia upon her death. The donation, however, did not come without a catch. Do you remember Mr. Capers? Having worked on the plantation for 40 years, he was considered family, and Ophelia put a clause in the donation that Rudolph Capers would have a job on the plantation for as long as he wanted it. He was the first tour guide for the newly formed Hofwyl Broadfield Plantation, state of Georgia historic site. Ophelia Dent passed away by a heart attack in her parlor on September 5, 1973, and it was Mr. Capers who found her. She was 86 years old. If you're ever on I-95 just south of Savannah and you see a sign for Darien, Georgia, get off the interstate and spend some time on the plantation. It's absolutely beautiful. Ophelia donated the remaining of the 1,200 acres, and it is still just like it was the day she died. From the mail on her desk to the Oldsmobile in the garage/ice house. Thanks for coming to Keeping History on Two Wheels. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button. It's right over here on the left. Don't forget to hit that bell so that you'll be notified whenever we do an upload, and we do one each and every week. If you like, leave a comment, be it good or bad, and a thumbs up or a thumbs down, whichever is your preference. Always remember, every trip starts with a step, and that step, well, it starts with you.